say to begin with about oxalate and sleep is that there is some indication now, which I was not aware of before, that oxalate may be neuroinflammatory. So if it's producing some level of inflammation for the nervous system, that's going to be absolutely a factor in whether or not we're sleeping properly or not. Because, the nervous system being able to come to the right kind of rest to be able to sort of close down the functions it needs to, and then be able to do its repair and rejuvenation kind of work, even to the point where we will have our brain doing things like, if you will, pruning memories to some degree. So I don't remember what I ate on Tuesday last week, for instance, but big things I'll remember. So your brain's doing a lot of things even while we're sleeping. But the link here between oxalate and sleep is also through histamine. So there's probably more than one place where oxalate is, if you will, touching our ability to sleep well. There is this neuroinflammatory piece, and then there's the whole histamine playing field. So let me talk through that just a little bit. No exam at the end of our conversation, as usual. So turns out that the US government has actually been doing research on the military, poor guys and gals who do that, on using histamine to keep us awake. Why? Histamine is the wakefulness chemical, or at least one of the key ones in our brains. So many of us may know, especially if we were a little bit of a nutrition geek even before we got into the oxalate rabbit hole, we may have known that about 4 o'clock in the morning, our adrenals start to release cortisol. Why? The cortisol is to sort of bring the body back online. It's marshaling resources. It's waking things up, quite literally. And the brain does a very similar process where it starts to release histamine at about 4 o'clock in the morning to bring the brain into wakefulness. Now, this is not supposed to be an immediate process. This is supposed to take a little bit of time as the level of histamine raises in the brain. And the challenge for those of us who have been dealing with oxalate for a long time is that the kind of irritation to the immune system, which can result in us running, let's say, with our engine a little bit hot. So we've got maybe a little bit too much histamine in the body and potentially in the brain itself. That means when we start to release it at 4 o'clock to wake us up slowly, we may be awake a lot sooner than we expect to be, and we may not be able to get back to sleep. And for a lot of people, that can be like a 2 to 4 a.m. kind of window, because we're just hovering too high in terms of the histamine inside the brain. Related to this would also be what oxalate is doing to the mast cells, because the mast cells are what's involved in releasing histamine. And interestingly enough, although they're inside the brain case, you have one of the more protected parts of the body, but there are actually mast cells in there. This was news to me because I thought mast cells were just in what I would call the open spaces in the body where outside meets inside. So inside the sinuses, inside the mouth, in the digestive tract, places where our body's going to have to be able to handle the potential that we could get exposed to bacteria or whatever from the outside world. And with that said, it turns out that we've got mast cells inside the brain case. So that might be related to how important the nervous system is in terms of our overall survival. But it does mean that we're vulnerable to anything which is going to impact that histamine level in the brain, and anything which is going to impact mast cells in the brain. And now that we have these indications that oxalate's neuroinflammatory, guess what appears to be getting into the brain? So we can have these multiple things that are affecting sleep. For a lot of people, the place where we get the biggest bang for the buck, I'll say, is to try and get at the histamine, and also to try and settle those mast cells down. So once we're in the process, we've reduced oxalate, we're starting to move it out of the body, and especially for those of us who might have some endogenous production, so we may be doing this over a longer time period even than other people who are dealing with an oxalate issue, but where it's really just their diet. So if we're doing this over a very long term with moving oxalate, every time we move oxalate, that can act as an irritation to those mast cells. And that can also impact this too much histamine on board. And perhaps we're getting a little more vulnerable in terms of our sleep. There's some really good research now on a really nice low oxalate kind of protocol. And this has been promoted by Andrew Huberman, who is a neurobiologist and ophthalmologist. And he runs this very interesting human, I'm going to say, maximizing capacity kind of lab out of Stanford. And he's talked about the combination of magnesium, no surprise, because we're probably low in magnesium if we're dealing with oxalate, theanine, another one of my favorite amino acids, where it actually helps to promote focus for the brain, but calm focus, as opposed to sort of that edgy kind of energy that you could get from caffeine. And interestingly enough, the effective ingredient from chamomile tea, which I always thought was more urban legend than true, and it's called apigenin. But your basic cup of chamomile tea can really help to support sleep. So the combination of those three are doing multiple things for the brain.